Hello, I'm Judy Cohen, a board member at the Holocaust Museum, Los Angeles. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Building Bridges, a monthly discussion series that brings together community leaders for conversations about working toward common social justice goals. The Jewish diaspora extends around the world, contributing to a multicultural global community of rich and varied traditions and cultural practices. How can we, as the Jewish community from different cultural backgrounds, foster unity and connection? Leaders from diverse Jewish communities will engage in a cross-cultural dialogue about the critical issues facing Sephardic, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazi Jews. This program is also part of our Sephardic and Mizrahi Stories series, exploring Sephardic and Mizrahi culture, history, and experiences. For today's discussion, we are absolutely pleased to welcome Sarah Levin, who is the Executive Director of JIMENA, Jews Indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. Welcome. Jasmin Niku Hakini, the president or the co-president of the board of 30 Years After. Rabbi David Barron of Beverly Hills, the Temple of the Arts. Welcome. Jordanna Gessler, Vice President of Education and Exhibits at the Holocaust Museum, Los Angeles. The Holocaust Museum, Los Angeles brings you programs like this on a regular basis. Similar to today's discussion, it is offered at no charge. If you do enjoy the programs and you would like to consider making a donation, we would sincerely appreciate that. We ask you to go to holocaustmuseumla.org to make a donation. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce to you the moderator of today's program, Museum Board, Dan Schnur. Dan is a professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and Pepperdine's School of Public Policy. He currently presents a weekly webinar for the LA World Affairs Council town hall called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. As one of California's leading political strategists, Dan has worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns. He has served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of US Senator John McCain, and was the chief media spokesman for California Governor Pete Wilson. Dan, thank you so much for helping us to create the Building Bridges and for serving as our moderator today. Dan?
Well, Judy, thank you so much for that very kind introduction and for your nice words. And thanks to all of you who've gathered for what I believe is a particularly important Building Bridges conversation. We've been holding these programs, and I know many have been regular attendees. We've been holding these programs on a monthly basis for almost a year and a half now. And most of our focus, as I think many of you know, has been on building bridges between the Jewish community and other communities in the Southland and the state and the nation. But I feel like today's conversation is a particularly important one. I'm so glad that you're all here for it. And I'm particularly happy that Jasmin and Sarah and Jordanna and Rabbi David Barron are all here with us as well. Because as important as it is to build those bridges between our own Jewish community and other communities in the region and in the state, many would argue that it's just as important, if not more important, for us to build those bridges within our own community. And I can't think of 4 people better equipped to lead us through this critically important conversation than the 4 guests we have here with us today. And so Jasmin, I'm going to start with you. And I'm going to ask if you can kick us off, given the work you do at 30 Years After, not just with the Persian and Sephardic communities, but to build bridges between our communities. I'm wondering if you could offer us some broader perspective. How would you characterize the relationship today between our various Jewish communities?
Sure. Thank you, Dan. And thank you to the Holocaust Museum, Los Angeles, for hosting this conversation. It's great to be here among friends and people I've worked with in the past. So I think the landscape has changed a lot in the last few decades, especially between the Iranian Jewish community and the larger Jewish community, I think we've made a lot of progress. It's no secret that the large influx of Iranian immigrants who came to LA in the late 70s changed the landscape of Jewish LA in major ways. I think the Persian Jewish community is much more integrated into the larger Jewish community now than it was a few decades ago. And I think that's for various reasons. One is that the Persian Jewish community has made an effort to reach out beyond its own community. The larger Jewish community has made an effort to try to integrate us into the landscape here. And I think, just the nature of being here for a longer period of time and the younger generations assimilating a little bit more. So you see this changing relationship on a personal level with, just the groups of friends that people have. You see it in the schools and the synagogues. And you also see it on an organizational level, on the various boards within the community. There's more crossover happening than before. If you go to the Russian Chabad's Shabbat, you'll see Israelis, you'll see Persians, you'll hopefully see Russians. I think it's interesting that the individuals leading the March of the Living Young Professional delegation at Sinai Temple happen to be Persian Jews, because in the past, most of the Holocaust-related programming was carried out by Ashkenazi Jews, because they tend to have more of a family and personal connection to that horrible period of time in Jewish history. But there's still opportunities for growth and areas for improvement. There's still a lot of, there can sometimes be tension and differences of opinions within the community about how to integrate the two groups and different approaches to how the Jewish community should improve. I think the Iranian Jewish community is also understanding that if we want to create positive change in our city and in our community, we can't do it alone, that we have to have strong friendships and relationships with the other ethnic communities within Jewish LA. So I think overall it's getting closer and building those good bridges, but there's still a lot of work we can do.
Okay. Jasmin, thank you so much. We really appreciate that as a framing for our conversation. Rabbi Baron, I'm going to ask you, David Baron, I'm going to ask you for your thoughts on this, because when we've talked previously, I've heard you make what I find to be a really, really important point, that the improvement in these relationships, on one hand, is a result of lots of hard work and good efforts of the type that Jasmin mentioned, and we'll talk more about a little bit later. But you've also spent a lot of time thinking about the external forces that are bringing the various segments of our community together. And I'm wondering if those are thoughts you'd be willing to share with our audience here today.
Sure. It's what we call the rabbi's lament, that sometimes it's anti-Semitism that makes Jewish people identify as Jews, that makes them connect with each other and realize that they have a common plight and destiny. And even if we look back during the pre-Shoah years in Europe, you'll see there were so many different streams. I think Professor Michael Berenbaum shared with me there were 25 different Jewish-related magazines and newspapers in the city of Warsaw. And they represented the socialists, the Bund, the Zionists, and of course we had the historical divisions. These divisions have always existed religiously, philosophically, and of course ethnically. And now that we find ourselves together in this American experience, it's really important that we recognize, as many of us did after that terrible attack at patrons in a restaurant in the Valley who were just sitting there having a meal at an Israeli restaurant, and a group of pro-Palestinian protesters attacked them. Or when we see what happened at Charlottesville with white nationalists carrying torches saying the Jews will not replace us. When we see these manifestations that many of the younger generation have never really experienced before, these manifestations of anti-Semitism, it makes us realize that as important as our differences are culturally and worthy of preservation, they're insignificant when it comes to confronting a common enemy that has our destruction or demise at their core. So for me, I don't think it should be a lament. I think we take this opportunity of what has occurred and make us recognize our common bonds of shared Jewish heritage and how being united in support of Israel and united in preserving our communities, it's a critical role. We're looking at this, as many synagogues are, for example, from the perspective of security. And we want to share with other synagogues in the community how we are able to best secure our institutions. The other point I'll mention is that we're a little different. Our synagogue is unaffiliated with any of the major movements. We're kind of a niche religion through the arts. And so we have a lot of people from different ethnic Jewish communities who just have kind of abandoned mainstream religion and are more interested in the artistic spiritual experience that we provide. But because we own a big theater, a 2,000 seat theater, the Saban Theater, we're able to open it to the community, and we've done so to Chabad and to the Persian Jewish community and to all the different members of the community, in a sense, to say, let's have a common place where we can share with one another. So those are my just kind of initial general observations on that theme.
Well, I'm eager to dig deeper with you, both on your thoughts about common challenges, bringing people together, but also on the unique role that your synagogue plays as a unifying force in our community. So if I can, I'd love to come back to you in just a minute or two and dig a little bit deeper onto those. Before that, though, I'd like to bring Jordanna Gessler into this conversation. And Jordanna, of course, the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles, where you hold such an important role, is an excellent example of what David is talking about. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit later in this conversation. But one of the things that I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about is, in addition to starting with the concept of facing a common challenge to bring people together. It's not unique to contemporary American Judaism or to contemporary United States. As David said, that's something that just Jewish communities dealt with in Europe and in other places in the world over the years, over the centuries. But in fact, the state of Israel itself, the Jewish homeland, provides us with some really valuable examples in this regard, does it not?
Yeah, and even in such a short time span that the modern state has been in existence, it has seen this sort of history of tension within the Jewish community. If you look at the 1970s, you have the film Casablanca, which tells the story of a Moroccan Jew, the love between a Moroccan Jew and a Russian Jew, and sort of how this was taboo. You even have the Israeli Black Panthers, which was founded in 1970, because Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews felt like second-class citizens and really identified with the American Black Panther movement. But then, of course, you have the Yom Kippur War in 1973, where Jewish teenagers are dying in the Golan, whether they be from Iraq, Morocco, or Poland. And so as Israel progresses over the decades, you see more collaboration and community building taking place, whether it is, as Rabbi Barron was saying, around the impact of anti-Semitism, in Israel's case, oftentimes like violence and attacks, military attacks, and camaraderie that builds within a military. But also, I think, from community building organizations, for example, when Ethiopian Jews were brought to Israel, and really understanding that this is a common thread that we all share, and no matter where we're from or where our ancestors are from, there's a really rich tapestry of culture that exists between us. And I think that this could be a really important example for our own community in understanding how to all come together.
Thank you so much, Jordanna. And as I said to David and Jasmin a moment ago, I really have many follow-up questions for you, but I am belatedly going to welcome Sarah Levin to our conversation. Sarah, you and your colleagues do such phenomenal work on this very challenge. And so in addition to an assessment of the landscape, if you don't mind, I think where we'd really benefit from hearing from you is what we can and should be doing to make these efforts more effective than they have been. So
sure.
We've heard about a good start here, but what else do we need to be doing?
So thank you for having me, first of all. And I just have to say that I agree with everything that all three panelists have said, but I'm also going to push back a little bit right now. So I'm just going to say that as the leader of an organization that's representing Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, I'm constantly hearing from young Sephardic Jews, from Sephardic lay leaders, from all different members of our community that they oftentimes don't feel included or seen, and that there is an existing division. And I think for some of the older Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews and people who have been here for many generations, what we've seen is young people becoming assimilated into mainstream Jewish culture, which is Ashkenazi Jewish culture, and then losing their heritage, their identity, and their connection to their family's ancestry. So there's a couple things. I just want to say that, first of all, I also hear that Middle Eastern Jewish communities in particular are insular. And I want to push back on this a lot and say that I don't think that's true. I think that for many generations, Middle Eastern and North African Jewish leaders and communities in the United States have made efforts to try and be a part of the mainstream, oftentimes unsuccessfully. So that begs the question, who is the insular community? Is it Middle Eastern Jewish communities, or is it an Ashkenazi Jewish establishment that's less willing to create programs and organizations that are reflective of the diversity of the Jewish people and Jewish experiences? So I think, first of all, a good first step is recognizing that, and recognizing that it's not on, the onus isn't necessarily on us as Mizrahi and Sephardic leaders and communities to become integrated. It's on, I think, the dominant culture and the dominant communities, which are Ashkenazi. And that's like no fault of anyone. That's a reflection of pure numbers and demographics, I think. So I think that's the first step, is recognizing that there is this division. And then I think we also have to recognize what binds us together. You know, there's one Torah, we're one people. Like Rabbi Barron said, anti-Semites, people who hate Israel, they don't distinguish between Middle Eastern and Ashkenazi Jews. They don't know the difference between an Iranian Jewish person in LA and an Upper West Side Ashkenazi Jew. We're all the same. But there's more than just that that binds us together. And I do think that's Judaism, that's Torah, that's our religious beliefs and values, our liturgy, so on and so forth. And I think we also need to recognize, finally, that the Jewish people are becoming more diverse. We're becoming multiracial, we're becoming multi-ethnic. Younger generations are more likely to hold multiple identities. And I'm not sure what this means for the Jewish community moving forward. We're less cohesive, and I don't even know how this will play out in terms of divisions between communities, because what is community in the end of the day, right? Like, if we are becoming increasingly diverse and less representative and inclusive of all of the facets of young Jews.
So all sorts of things to dig deeper on. And I think your first point is the most important one. And I think we can all agree that even given the progress that some of the others have talked about, we wouldn't be having a conversation like this. We wouldn't have scheduled it if there wasn't much, much more work to be done. So I'm very glad that you reminded us that while forward steps are important, there are a lot more steps to be taken. And Sarah, I'd like to stay with you going forward if we can, because one of the things that I think our audience is going to find most helpful is to understand not just what you think about these challenges, but why you think it. And as I understand, your own very unique heritage gives you a perspective on this that many of the rest of us don't, and in fact can't share. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about where this sentiment comes from within you.
Sure. So I'll just say, though, that my identity is not unique, especially in Israel, which is a melting pot. But I'm the product of one of those inter-ethnic marriages from the 1970s. My father is a Sephardic Jew and my mother is an Ashkenazi Jew. And growing up, I was keenly aware of the differences between my family members and also how they were received in a larger Jewish community. On the one hand, my mother's father was a Holocaust survivor, and that was the part of my Jewish identity and story that I was told was the most important by the larger community growing up. Counter to that was my papu, who was a Ladino-speaking Sephardic Turkish Jew. And the only time that I felt connected to his heritage wasn't in synagogue or Jewish day camps or in any kind of Jewish program that I was a part of, it was really only with my family. And I don't think that that is a unique experience. I think that there are a lot of, mixed people like me, especially younger people who had that experience. And in Israel, it's, I think, actually more the norm than anything else. So I've seen those divisions play out within my family and also in the larger community. And it's given me a unique vantage point to understand the opportunities and also the challenges. And that's what sort of drew me into this.
Okay, so in other words, so you are the bridge that we are building. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I am the bridge, and there are many other bridges like me. And I think if we're talking about intersectionality, which has been the word of the day these last few years, there are a lot of Jews like me who hold not just like intra-Jewish identities, but also relate as being multiracial and coming from diverse backgrounds, whether it's an interfaith background or an interracial background, or Jews by choice. And all of us have this unique ability to connect to two different, usually distinct cultures and groups of people. And that's something we should be leaning into, especially if we want to build stronger relationships within the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community.
Sarah, thank you so much. We're going to come back to you for a lot more in a little while. But right now, I'd like to go back to Jordanna, because Jordanna, your own personal background gives you some perspective on this, both on the opportunities, but also on the challenges, particularly as they exist for us here in Los Angeles. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about where you came from and how that affects the way you look at this.
Of course. And I do think that like a lot of what we mirror in American society, it tends to be a very Western, European-centric, Ashkenazi society. And so then when you are in places like Israel, which, kind of veer a little bit more away from that, you shift also in your thinking. So I think, as Sarah was saying, it's not necessarily, the burden is on all of us to break through our understanding of history and look at it beyond European history and the way that Europeans tend to zone in on it. But I'm originally from New York City, and I think that there's less of a divide within the Jewish community because there's less of a divide in the city per se. New York City has a much longer history of being a melting pot for so many different types of people that the differences seem to be the things that unite us. And if you look at the history of Los Angeles, it's a little bit shorter as far as new settlers to the area and as far as an established large Jewish community. And so I think, the challenges of moving past such an isolated city where it's more of like 30 different cities all sort of pushed together and reaching out and building a bridge to someone else and saying, how do we work together and learn from one another?
Okay. Well, and it is more difficult in Los Angeles, not just for cultural and historical reasons, but for traffic reasons too. And I don't mean to use that as an excuse, but we all know what it's like moving just logistically from one end of the city to the other, but that's no excuse. And David, what fascinates me most about what you do and what you're doing, because for those of you who don't know, Rabbi David Barron isn't just the rabbi at the Temple of the Arts. He founded this synagogue, the largest arts and entertainment industry synagogue in the United States. And from your personal perspective, working to use the arts as a unifier, as you alluded to a few minutes ago, really does provide opportunities to overcome those barriers and build bridges in a way that's not available in a more conventional setting. Can you talk a little bit more about what motivated you and how it's having that kind of an effect for you and your congregation?
Well, my congregation has a lot of Jews who are post-denominational. In other words, their ethnicity matters less, and they relate to each other in terms of their involvement in the world of entertainment and also relating to the arts, because we do an exploration of religion through music, drama, art, dance, and film. And so they have gravitated, thankfully, to us and stuck with it. a number of them happen to be of Sephardic origin. Our main benefactor, Chaim Saban, grew up in Alexandria, Egypt, before he moved to Israel. And he looked upon his minority group of Jews from North Africa as being discriminated against by the establishment in Israel, which was mostly Russian European Jews. We had an interesting experience. One Yom Kippur, I invited Shlomo Mola, who was the Speaker of the Knesset, to come and speak about his journey from Ethiopia to Israel. And he described how he made the long trek and lost relatives, got on the plane and landed in Israel. And he walked outside and he looked around and he said, "White Jews?" He was shocked. He had never seen that many white Jews before in his life. He'd seen maybe one or two attachés and coming in from Israel, but here it was surrounded by a sea of white faces. To me, that makes a really interesting commentary that our experiences as a Jewish people are so much stronger in terms of uniting us than the ethnic or the divisions that have historically kept us apart. So we have Persian Jewish members of our synagogue as well, and some of them work in the industry, some don't. But the bottom line is they're there to share the experience as opposed to the camaraderie that they would be sharing in a primarily or exclusively Persian Jewish synagogue. So I think that, when we talk about building bridges, it requires some steps and some active programming to accomplish that objective. You can't just say it's going to happen organically. You have to go about creating the experiences that will bring those communities together. I said for many years that one of the best antidotes to anti-Semitism is to invite a non-Jew to your home to observe Shabbat and to sit around your table, or to invite a non-Jew to your Passover Seder and explain to them what the Jewish people are about. And someone like that, who's had an experience of shared meal and experience with you, is so much less likely to participate in an anti-Semitic or anti-Israel organized rally. And if that's true of building bridges as an antidote to anti-Semitism, as we say, how much more so is it true if we would have shared meals and experiences with members of the North African Jewish community, the Moroccan Jewish community, the Yemenite, the Sephardic communities of Spain and of Italy, and the Ashkenazi, quote unquote, establishing community. I want to just push back on Sarah a little bit and say, Sarah, my answer to your question about insularity, is it the establishment of the Ashkenazi Jewish community or the minority Sephardic communities that see themselves as the minority? And my answer to you is both. They both do, because I've experienced that where I've really dressed down some people who've said, oh, well, they have different customs. We do it our way. If you don't have gefilte fish and matzo ball soup on Friday night, it's not a Shabbat dinner. And I push back on those people. And then I get from the Iraqi and Persian Jewish community that it has to be this way. And my answer is both. Elu v'elu, these and those are the words of the living God. All these customs and traditions are part of our fabric of history, and we need to create experiences that will bring the communities together. Unless you are actually planning to do that, it won't occur. So there has to be a proactive steps taken to accomplish that objective, in my opinion.
Well, they say that the best bridges are built from both banks of the river. But Jasmin, I want to come to you on this, because David Barron made another really important point. He talked about tangible steps in active programming that can help bring our communities together. It said that specificity and familiarity are the enemies of prejudice and hatred. And so when you do spend more time with someone, as David said, it's a lot harder to hate them or even to distrust them. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your work with 30 Years After. And Judy mentioned at the beginning, by the way, that Jasmin is the co-president of the board at 30 Years After. It's worth also noting that it's not as if she's just come to this organization and this work. For those of you in the audience, Jasmin was actually a founding member of 30 Years After. And she's been on the board of directors since 2007, I've been told, which I believe is actuarially impossible, but I will take your word for it. What attracted me to 30 Years After, and it's an organization I've gotten really involved in and I really think highly of, is its commitment to build these bridges and to bring people from various communities together. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what you do and how you do it there.
Sure, I'd love to. And you've been a tremendous friend and resource in our work, so thank you. So 30 Years After specifically has a newer fellowship designed to bring the two communities together. We're very proud of the Marathi Berkowitz Public Service Fellowship. Its mission is to provide young leaders with the opportunity to take their public service skills to the next level while intentionally building bridges between Iranian American Jewish leaders and our non-Iranian counterparts. So we had the first cohort of this fellowship last year. Unfortunately, it had to be virtual, but I think people still really gained a lot from it. And Purim, the holiday Purim, happened to be right in the middle of the fellowship. And we realized that, Purim is a Persian story. Queen Esther was from the ancient, Persian Empire, and yet it's never told from that perspective. It's not really, so it's kind of like Sarah mentioned, it's taught from an Ashkenazi perspective almost. You just barely mention where it happened and that's it. So we tried our best to kind of reclaim it a little bit. We provided mishloach manot to all the participants, and in addition to the traditional hamantashen, we threw in some traditional Persian snacks. We had a session on Iranian American Jewish history and tried to encourage our community and others to think about quote unquote modern day Esthers who are advocating for women and for the Jewish people. But we had to think about it and do it ourselves. It was not something that non-Persians really thought to do, and it's an example of trying to add to the Eurocentric lens that Judaism is usually presented through. So I'm happy to answer more questions about the fellowship offline if necessary. I don't want to take away from from this conversation. But we are hoping to do another fellowship early next year. And again, the plan is to have half the group be from an Iranian Persian background and the other half not, to intentionally continue to build these bridges.
And what I will add to Jasmin's point, I'll make a more shameless plug than she just did. If you are either a Sephardic or Ashkenazi aspiring young Jewish community leader, or you know one, or have a child or grandchild who fits that description, let Jasmin and her colleagues at 30 Years After know. They really do run phenomenal programming. I'll say with some pride is the Berkowitz end of the Marathi Berkowitz Fellowship is named after my grandparents, the late Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz. And one of the main reasons for my involvement is when I was growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the 1970s, there was not a very significant Iranian American Jewish population for reasons that most students of history understand. But for those of you who either remember or have studied history know that that was a time when Soviet Jewry was one of the great challenges that our people faced. And at the time that the Soviet leadership began allowing many of their Jewish population to leave the USSR to come to the United States, our city was one of the primary places where they settled. And one of the first lessons I learned as a very young child from my parents and grandparents was the importance of building bridges to welcome other members of the Jewish community, even if they talked differently and dressed differently and acted differently. And it's a lesson that I'm thrilled to see Jasmin and her colleagues, Sarah and her colleagues, David, Jordanna, all of you carry forward. With that, we now return you to your regularly scheduled webinar. And what I'll do is we're a little bit past the halfway point, so I'll remind those of you in the audience that if you'd like to ask a question, the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen is the best opportunity for you to do so. And if you have a question you'd like to put to any or all of our guests, please feel free to type the question in, and I'll do everything I can to make sure that as many of those questions as possible get asked. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for their questions, let's look forward. And Jordanna, I'm going to come back to you because you used a term earlier today that I've heard you use in the past, which I had never heard until I met Jordanna Gessler, which I just find fascinating. And that's the term Ashkenormative. And I think it speaks a little bit to the point that Sarah was making earlier, that even if, as David says, there's responsibilities on both sides of the river to build a bridge across, just the sheer size of one of these communities does create certain non-surprising tendencies. And I wonder if you can talk about the importance of recognizing those tendencies, and maybe talk a little bit about how at the museum, at the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles, how you've talked about the Shoah in a way that is not the sole province of any particular community within among Jews, but a tragedy that all of us share.
Yeah, so exactly. Everything that you were saying, it's so important for us when we have students come to the museum, whether they be Jewish or not Jewish, for them to walk away with not just an understanding of the Holocaust, but an understanding of the Jewish people, the diversity, the vibrant community. And so we talk about, whether the fact that the Holocaust didn't just transpire in Europe, that it wasn't just Ashkenazi Jews who were impacted. And although Poland prior to 1939 was the single largest Jewish community in the world, there was still a vibrant diversity in the globe and impacted and became victims and survivors of the Holocaust. So whether it's talking about a Persian Jewish man who was living in Greece with his wife who ends up being murdered in Treblinka, or it's the Jews in North Africa who were impacted because of, the colonies being taken over by Italy and Germany, or it was the fact that 96% of the Sephardic Greek Jewish community was murdered in the Holocaust. And, Sarah mentioned the language Ladino. People talk about how Yiddish was virtually lost during the Holocaust. Ladino was virtually lost during the Holocaust. And so really for people to understand the diversity of Jewish victims in the Holocaust, it's not just an Ashkenormative story, that it's not this Eurocentric story, that it actually has lessons for all of us to learn from is really important. And something we oftentimes do with students is we ask them to share a little bit about where their family came from, maybe to bring an object that represents their heritage. And so you can have a really interesting cross-cultural conversation between even just a group of Jewish students who are there on a synagogue religious school tour about all the different places their families have come from and all the trials and tribulations that they've been through, and how despite and in spite that, they still maintain this incredible Jewish identity that bonds them. So I think that education is definitely a key piece of this, and also us re-examining the ways in which history has been taught over the last few decades and sort of correcting the places where we might have made mistakes.
Okay. And I know for those of you who take part in our Building Bridges programs regularly, you hear me say this regularly, but especially now that we move, maybe not all the way past COVID, but to a potentially safer period. If you haven't had a chance to visit the museum, or if you haven't visited even since before the shutdown, Jordanna and her colleagues there will be thrilled to bring you over, because as valuable as the online programming is, nothing can match actually having the experience in person. And I think there's great benefits that come from it. So thank you, Jordanna, and we'll see you there in the very near future. Sarah, I wanted to bring you back into the conversation. You made a really important point earlier, just about the size of the Ashkenazi Jewish community. But I think in addition to sort of that imbalance, one of the things I've heard you talk about before, which I find particularly compelling, is not just about the importance of whoever you are, Ashkenazi or Sephardic, not just making the effort to build a bridge, but how to build the bridge. And I've heard you talked about it a little bit earlier, but if someone's watching this, regardless of their own heritage, and say, yeah, I want to help build a bridge for my side of the brine. And yes, I'll go to an event, I'll go to a program, I'll meet people who aren't like me. What do I do once I get there? How do I build a bridge?
Sure. So I think everyone in this conversation has brought up really useful ways to build those bridges. I think what Jordanna touched on re-examining how and why and the ways history has been taught and what we focused on is a really important first step. I think to understand our difference, we need to understand a little bit of like how we got to where we are right now. And I'm not sure that all Ashkenazi Jews know that there were close to 1 million Jews from the Middle East and North Africa who were either ethnically cleansed or fled anti-Semitic persecution or were displaced because of political instability. And it wasn't that long ago. It was within the last, 60 years, 70 years. So I think first and foremost, recognizing that history, recognizing the fact that we have a lot of immigrants in the United States who are from these countries, and also recognizing the fact that more than half of Israel's population are Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews. So I think those are really good starting places. And then I think, of course, participating in programs. And I think if you're leading a Jewish institution, it sounds like Rabbi Barron has done a really great job with this, understanding that we have these are systemic issues. If we're a leader, we have a responsibility and the ability to look at our boards, to look at our programs, to look at our staff, and to make sure that as an institution, we're inclusive, because if we are inclusive of diverse experiences and communities, that will be reflected in our programs and the type of offerings that we provide and the people who come to participate in our organizations. And then I think, of course, there's also the ability for everyone to seek out organizations like 30 Years After and JIMENA, and to look at the landscape of Sephardic Jewish life in North America and to find ways to be supportive of initiatives that bring Sephardic Mizrahi Jews together internally and also externally. So I hope that answers the question.
It certainly does. I always teach my classes in the construct of threes. And my students always know that when I frame something as three things, they know they're going to get asked about it on a midterm or a final. So what I take away from this is I took it away in threes. One, we need to spend more time together so we can learn more about each other. Second, we need to recognize that much, not all, but much of what we think we know about other communities isn't necessarily correct. And that it's not just going to a program with people with different perspectives than ours, but recognizing that what we think we know going in might not always be accurate. And third, the answer ultimately is better communications. And that's not just talking, but it's listening. And Jasmin, this to me is what 30 Years After does so successfully. We talked about the fellowship a little bit earlier, but what I'd like to do with you is dig a little bit deeper and hear you talk more, if you can, about the importance of focusing these efforts on young people. Obviously, people of every age of any generation benefit from this kind of guidance, even old people like me. But this program is being run for young Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, not for their parents and grandparents. How come?
I think the most important work is to bring the next generation together and help them develop the tools to bring our communities closer together. And I think the programming is really important. And the last few years, you've seen more of a focus on Sephardic and Mizrahi communities as part of the larger organizations in LA. They'll specifically do events focusing on these communities. And for example, right now we're in the middle of Mizrahi Remembrance Month, and you can see that all over social media. And for all of its faults, I actually think social media has been a great tool and a great resource to share information, especially around the holidays. You see a lot of cool, interesting content about how different ethnic communities, Jewish ethnic communities, either celebrate the holiday or, even just the different foods that our communities eat to break the fast after Yom Kippur. Also more substantive topics like sharing the history of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews in the Middle East, which is something that isn't necessarily taught in schools, even Jewish schools, and a lot of people may not know about. So again, for all of its downsides, we do have these new tools at our disposal, and the younger generation is spending a lot of time on them more than the more traditional avenues of receiving information. So I think using tools like social media and whatever will emerge next to help share this wealth of knowledge, whether it's just about stuff like the different foods and music that the different communities have, or the important historical knowledge that will be lost if we don't share it. I think those are important tools, and also I think the schools are starting to understand and accept that more diverse, that they need to present a diverser view of the Jewish community. You might have a school with a very large Persian student population, and yet when they teach Jewish history, the students don't hear much about their own parents and grandparents and where they came from. And I think that's important to recognize and work on as well.
Thank you, Jasmin. David, before you point out to me that people of all ages can benefit from these kind of lessons and these kind of experiences, I'll acknowledge that, of course, that's one of the real extraordinary things about what you and your congregation does constantly. But you were telling me earlier this week about one example of that, which was really striking, and I think our audience would really benefit from hearing about it. You were telling me about the guest speaker that you had come to the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and I'm wondering if you could take a couple of minutes and tell us that story and why you found it so effective.
Well, I think it was a great example of building a bridge, but let me back up by saying that the history of Christian anti-Semitism has been so well documented and written about, but to a much lesser extent, the history of Muslim anti-Semitism has not been documented as extensively. And we know that Jewish communities were forced in Morocco into the Mellah, into the ghetto, and the origin of that word has its own horrific connotations, which I'm not going to go into. But we know that Jews were second-class citizens. They were dhimmis. That whole notion of dhimmitude was prevalent throughout North Africa and many parts of the Muslim world. We know that special tax was levied against Jews, the jizya, and Jews had that second-class status and suffered in those countries. Even though many of them prospered, there was a lot of discrimination. And we overlook that. We don't hear those stories, which are really instructive and important. And in the case of the regime in Iran, I guess it's, to me, as close as you get to modern day fascism. So many people being brutalized for only wanting to follow their own passion. The Jewish community very marginalized there, even though the regime will say, oh, we treat our Jews very well. A closer examination and the fact that so many fled is the best indication that that's just simply not true. So I wanted to build a bridge with members of the Iranian community who were Jewish and who were not Jewish to find out about what is going on and how we can take steps. And so I invited a woman who was just amazing. Her name is Masih Alinejad. And Masih led the women's rebellion in Iran. She encouraged women to hold up their iPhones or their devices, turn their face away so they wouldn't be recognized, and tear the chador off their head and throw it on the ground. And hundreds of thousands of women did so. And then she held White Wednesdays, where she asked women to wear white scarves. And she eventually developed 7 million followers in Iran and worldwide. And much to the scorn and anger of the regime, which wanted to arrest her, they interrogated her brother, they interrogated her mother, they imprisoned her brother, and she fled to the United States and had to move from safe house to safe house because the regime sent a kidnapping and assassination squad to grab her and bring her back to Iran for execution, or to execute her in Venezuela, where they were going to take her to. So her story was so compelling, and what she did was such an example of personal heroism, which was part of the theme of my sermon on Yom Kippur, what one individual can do who seemingly didn't have maybe the bona fides to undertake that, just who was a regular person. She came from a small village in Iran. And I wanted to use that to also build connections with the Ashkenazi Jewish community and the Persian community, within the Persian community, for those anti-regime Iranian Muslims who live here in the United States, and of course, the Jewish Persian community. And we were able to have a series of events leading up to her speaking on Yom Kippur, as well as having her in an afternoon discussion. And to me, that's an example of how you build a bridge within those communities. And I think it's something that can and should be accomplished, but you need to take the initiative to do that. And I think that certainly I'm putting it out there for Jasmin or Sarah, if they want to discuss ways that examples of programming we've undertaken that you might find relevant or meaningful, we're glad to have that conversation with you.
So I'm going to remind our audience, because we only have a few minutes left, that if you do have any questions, entering them in the Q&A box is the best way to make sure that they're asked. But I'd like to come back to Sarah. And Sarah, one of the other things that, a point that you've made to me previously, which I'll have to admit I had not thought of nearly as much as I should have, is in addition to the benefits of strengthening these relationships and building these bridges on a communal level, it's good for us to know people who aren't like us better for all sorts of feel-good reasons. There's some real practical benefits to strengthening those relationships too, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, building community means that we're building, the financial capital of our institutions. We're building relationships between people. We're creating a stronger, more unified Jewish community. I just want to go back, if that's okay, to what Rabbi Barron was saying, and say, the power of storytelling is the heart of JIMENA. JIMENA was created during the Second Intifada a long time ago, because our co-founders, who are all former Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa, recognized that on college campuses, students were not being taught the stories of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, that there was a gap in Jewish life, and that no institution was providing a platform for Jewish refugees from the region to share their personal stories. So the core of our work, and it remains the core of our work, is former Jewish refugees from the region who are committed to sharing their personal stories with diverse audiences in the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community around the United States and around the world globally. We do work in the Middle East and North Africa as well. And I think that is one way to rectify some of the problems that we have with history telling and sharing the stories of Jewish people. And it also provides a validation and support. I mean, there's nothing more powerful than a former refugee, like a Holocaust survivor, being given the opportunity to talk about what happened to them and to answer questions from curious students. And this is what we need to be doing more of, not just for the Jewish community, but so the non-Jewish community also understands who we are and where we come from. I'm very proud of that work that JIMENA has done. We've presented, our speakers have shared their personal stories in thousands of spaces, including many venues in LA, synagogues, all of the universities. So anyways, that's it. Sorry to go away from your question.
No, that's okay. I think it provided some very, very helpful additional perspective to what we've been hearing from David. So Sarah, that was perfect. We've only got a few minutes left. And so I'm going to ask each of you briefly. We do have a question in the Q&A box, which is asking, are your groups functioning in other cities? Now, Sarah, I know that you are in San Francisco, but I'm wondering if, for all of you, if you can talk about the scope of your organization, or if your organization's not operating in other cities, if there are similar organizations that do this work elsewhere in the state or the country. So Sarah, we'll start with you, just because I think your answer is yes, but maybe you can talk
Yes.
a little bit more about the scope of the work that you and your colleagues do.
Yeah, so there's two elements of JIMENA's work. One is advocacy, and that is fighting for the rights of former Jewish refugees at the federal level and at the state level. And then the second piece of our work is education and engagement, and that work we do globally. So we have outreach in Arabic in the Middle East and North Africa. We present at all different types of institutions throughout the United States and in Europe. I'm really proud to say that we've grown, but we're still very much a California organization. Like our strongest partnerships, the majority of our work happens here in the state of California.
Okay. Jordanna, you obviously help run the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles, but there are certainly other Holocaust museums around the country, correct?
There certainly are, and there are about 8 different Holocaust museums across the country, and then of course, Holocaust museums across the globe, not just in Europe, in the US, in Asia, and in Africa and Australia as well, and in South America. I would say Antarctica is probably the only continent without a Holocaust museum. But the work that Holocaust Museum LA does is national and international. During the pandemic, we launched virtual student tours and have had visiting school groups virtually from as far north as Anchorage, Alaska, and across the country and also the globe. So we've also been giving opportunity for students outside of California to learn more about this history. But yes, as Dan said, there are a number of different institutions and synagogues that I think can really speak to the diversity within the Jewish community and how we can all come together.
Great, thank you, Jordanna. And Jasmin, I know that 30 Years After does not yet have a chapter in Antarctica either, yet. But this type of good work is being done, not just here in Los Angeles, but elsewhere. Maybe you can talk for a minute about other organizations that do work similar to yours.
Sure, we are focused on LA. The largest Iranian Jewish community in the United States is in LA, and maybe one of the biggest in the world, I want to say, but don't quote me on that. So we definitely have colleagues in New York and Israel and a few other cities across the US that we work with and have similar goals, but we are focused on the Los Angeles Jewish community. There's plenty of work to do here. And there's a lot of potential for our community. That's the reason the organization began. The younger generation, my generation, realized that our parents didn't have the opportunity to vote and be involved in the democratic process and civic affairs and really contribute to the political landscape in Iran. And we do have that opportunity. So it's on us to push our community in the right direction. We think we're making progress, but as we all heard today, there's a lot of work to do in our community and in the other ethnic groups within the Jewish LA community. So maybe one day we'll expand, but for now we're mostly in LA.
Well, and Rabbi David Barron, I'll give you the last word in this conversation. Clearly the work that you and your colleagues do at Temple of the Arts, I think is just visionary. But please tell me you're not the only place in the country that has recognized the value of using the arts to enrich the Jewish religious experience.
I think there are others, and I believe that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So I will hope that there will be others who will be inspired. Everything, some synagogues do an arts program, but we're all about the arts. So we have an art and meditation prayer book. Our services are live streamed, and for 20 years before that, broadcast on JLTV around the world. And we do live stream a lot of our programming. I mentioned the debate that we had, one of our debates, 2 very prominent individuals. It was on C-SPAN. So we do reach a broader audience. I don't know if our particular formula is being copied in the exact way in other cities or communities, but certainly if anybody reaches out to find out about it, we're very open to sharing what we do.
Here's hoping they will. Rabbi David Barron from Temple of the Arts, Sarah Levin from JIMENA, Jasmin Niku from 30 Years After, and Jordanna Gessler from Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles. Thank you all so much for helping lead us through such an important and such an interesting conversation. We're grateful to all of you.
Thank you, Dan, for being such a great moderator. I will tell you, having been moderated before, you're one of the best.
Well, very nice to say so. I also want to thank the power behind the scenes, Harmony Barker, the director of programming at the museum who runs these programs, as well as Beth Keene, Guy Lipa, and the rest of Jordanna's colleagues at the Holocaust Museum of Los Angeles. And most importantly, want to thank all of you for joining us for this month's Building Bridges conversation. We'll be back again on Wednesday, December 8th for a conversation about the Jewish and African American community experience. We'll be sending you more information on that. We'll hope you'll join us. But in the meantime, thanks so much to all of you. Have a wonderful evening. And if we don't talk beforehand, happy Hanukkah.
Thank you. And Thanksgiving.